So today I'm covering some of the data that was done by my graduate student who was working on a very extensive study looking at several interactions of some of the management factors. So I'm talking today about 18 environments over 2019 and 20, mostly in the eastern part of North Dakota. This data would be applicable in also Northwest Minnesota. However, some of the principles are valid throughout the state, and I will kind of highlight those aspects. We have talked extensively already about the risk of frost. This last year was an extremely early frost that first week of September. And anytime when you have a later maturing variety, the top leaves are probably going to be affected. And also the oil tends to be lower if there is a frost event because there is not enough late season photosynthesis taking place. So if we are going to analyze the data, I will point out what the effects might have been from the frost in this past year. So we have talked about several aspects, the importance of maturity, selecting the right type of maturity, looking at row spacing, looking at population, and then also early planting date. So individually, we know that all these factors can have a positive effect on yield. So the question that I wanted to answer here is, what about if you combine those factors, and can we have a synergy between some of those factors so that we can recommend that if you do one of the factors like selection of the maturity, what would be the other factors that could benefit to maximize the yield in those cases? So basically we had two variety maturity of an 05 and an 08. And then we had early planting, and early planting was as early as we could get in, and then about 2 weeks later. Now, the 2 weeks later was roughly when 50% of the acres in North Dakota were planted. So I looked at the statistical service data. So the early planting would be considered to be early planting throughout the state. And then the populations, now I'm talking here about seeding rate, and some of the questions that have been asked so far by the attendees is, population, but we're having a difference between seeding rate and actually the plant established. And I will show you a few figures in a moment as well. So I'm just giving you kind of a little bit of a update on some of those factors. Now, here on the left, we see bushels per acre. So this is expressed in bushels. And then the bars, the red bar is indicating early planting, and the green bar is late planting. So let's look at the first two bars. You can see on the bottom, this is environment, and I call it environment Northwest 22, which is near Fargo. We have Castleton, Prosper, Ransom, Sargent, Steele, and then we have the average. So if you look here at the two bars, the red bar of early planting was higher, but I don't have a letter there, meaning I could not tell there was a significant difference. However, the next bar, you can see early planting was significantly high yielding than late planting. So the tendency has been that the red bars are higher. When you do trials, sometimes it is like a flip-flop. And in Ransom, as you can see, late planting was higher yielding than early planting. And that had to do that we had a little bit of a stand establishment issue due to crusting. So the last bar is looking at the average. And as you can see, there was not much difference in 2009. However, if you look at 2020, we had a lot of growing degree day units accumulating during the early part of the summer. So early planting with that nice heat resulted in many of the bars showing a letter difference. So when it is A and B, it means that the A is significantly higher. So typically in all the trials, we see that the A early planting out-yielded the late planting, and the last bar showing that there is a significant advantage of early planting. So early planting, 2 weeks early, means as soon as the conditions are right. I did not go by calendar date, I go by conditions. And when we say conditions, we need to have about 50-degree soil temperatures, looking in the forecast, no frost in the forecast. And so the conditions of the field are ready. I do not advocate just going only by the calendar date, because that will lead to disaster. We need to use some of those measurements as soil temperature and the forecast. So then combining the data from early planting to late planting over those all those environments, 80 environments, we see that early planting had an A versus late planting B, and that resulted in a 7% higher yield due to early planting. So the cost is really, there's no cost involved in early planting. You know, it requires the work and it requires timing, but there is a benefit of early planting. So that is the first factor that we looked at. So the second factor that I want to talk about is that the early planting also has an effect with field conditions. So when I'm looking here at two environments that I'm comparing, I'm looking at one environment where there was tile drainage and one environment that there was no tile drainage. So although the conditions were ready to plant, the conditions in the no tile were, or where it was tile, were better than where there were no tile. And I'm going to highlight here the early planting difference. Those environments are basically side by side, and there was a big difference in the environment. So here was an environment where tile drainage made the conditions really suitable for that early planting. And there we saw a 13 bushel increase, which is 28%. So when we talk about management and conditions, we need to also consider environment. So in this case, under the tile drainage conditions, the early planting had actually more benefits. Then if you look here at the green bars, early plant or late planting on tile versus non-tile didn't make that much difference. And that is logical, because the benefit of tile is really to getting into that field earlier. Now, I have been working with tile drainage for quite a while, and I combined here 20 environments all the way from 2011 up to 2019. And if you look at the graph, the end bar of the average will show that there was a significant difference in having tile, and the yield advantage of this was about 7% high yielding over the environment where the tile was not even running. In some of the dry years, low yielding environment, high yielding environments, 7% high yielding. So in other words, tile does work and it has a benefit. And if you have tile, then you can also adjust some of the other management factors that I'm talking about. So we have talked about early planting. Now, the second factor that we consider here is the early and late maturing. So the theory is that a late maturing variety, and it's planted at the same day, it has some more days at the end of the season to capture some more sunlight and will have some advantage. So here, the green bar is the early variety and the red bar is the late variety. And this was in 2019. And you see that the late variety was consistently higher yielding than the early variety. So the conclusion for 2019 was that there is a yield advantage using the late maturing variety having some extra days in the field. However, if we are looking at 2020 where we had this early frost, now things start to change in certain environments. So in the first bars, you can see that the late variety, the red bars in the first, second, and the third and the fourth one are higher. But if we look at Ransom County, actually the variety that was with an early maturing out-yielded the late one. And that was an example of where we had frost damage. So here, the risk of having a late maturity ended up that it was a yield penalty. So then if we are looking at the 2 years side by side, in 2019, we saw a benefit for early maturing. In 2020, it was a wash, but over the 2-season 18 environment, there was still an average advantage, and that was about 6%. Now, the data and the numbers I'm giving you here, like the 7% in the previous set and the 6% here, is just kind of a snapshot. Every field is going to be slightly different depending on the variety, the environment, etc. It is just an indication that it is very likely that if you use a later maturing variety, if you can, that it will benefit. So now we're talking about seeding rate, and we have to kind of distinguish between seeding rate and we have to look at plant population. And we know when we plant 100 live seeds, we know that they should germinate. So we're already compensating for germ percentage. So we have 100 seeds that we know that germinate. We put them in the soil. We'll never get 100 plants. We might get 90, 95, depending on how well you do with planting. And typically what happens is there might be 2 seeds that come together. They don't germinate. There is a rock. There are some insects that might eat it. Various reasons that you don't get plants. Now, that is the established plants in the spring. But then if you'll go through the season, there is again a number of plants that don't make it to the full plant. So when we talk here seeding rate, I'm making the assumption that 10% of the plants don't make it, or the seed doesn't make it to a plant, and that we have some losses. So this one is seeding rate. So we have 2 seeding rate. So the normal population would be in the range of 150,000 established plants, and 185 is slightly higher. And as you can see in 2019, the higher population had a slightly higher increase. In 2020, it was basically a wash. So if we look or combined, there was a minute increase in yield, only 1% higher. So that just that bump in 20,000 seeds over those 18 environments barely made a dent in the yield. Now, the question that I was asking is, what about the combination? So here I'm looking at the early and the late planted. So the early planted is in the red bar. So if you look here at the A's above this group, those group is significant, or is kind of similar in significance, but it is all higher than the second group. So what is the difference? Well, the difference in 2019 was that it was the late maturing variety that ended up having the higher yield, dominating the early planting and late planting, and that the early maturing was significantly lower. However, if you look here, still the highest was achieved with the early planting, with the late maturing, and with the highest seeding rate. So if we look at the last year, it was slightly different, and the late maturing, due to the frost, was also kind of set back a little bit more. And here we can see that the A is early planting dominated everything. So in this case, dominance of the early planting. If we combine them, now we still come to the same conclusion that early planting has the dominance, and then second is the maturity of the variety, and third is the seeding rate. So as you can see, they work together. So if you have a choice, the best would be to grow as early as possible with a maturity that is really adapted for the region, and you could bump up the seeding rate a little bit. And my explanation is that when you plant a little bit earlier, we have a little bit more stress in the environment. Not all the plants will make it, but also we want to get early season interception taking place with the solar radiation. So that is some of the factors that we are looking at. So one of the things that we need to consider is row spacing and seeding rate, and also the interception of sunlight. So here I have a graph indicating that we have 80,000 seeds and 200,000 seeds in 24-inch. And basically what I did is I took a picture, and on the bottom I used an app, Canopio. Whatever was green turns into white and black, and that gives you a ratio. So in this case, on 80,000 live seeds on 24 at 52% of cover. If you increase the seeding rate, you have more percent cover. But now look between the 24 and the 12-inch. This is early season, but you can see this is with 80,000 is 63%, and with 200,000 live seeds, which is a little high, but it has 83% coverage. So I think when we think about seeding rate and row spacing, we are trying to maximize that early season interception of sunlight, and that will set us up for good yield potential. So here is comparing the row spacing, 12 inches and 24. And I wanted to kind of point out here the emerged stand is the first column versus the final stand that is at the end of the season, so just before harvest. And we can see here that there is a difference in loss. So in the 12-inch, we had 5.6% loss. In the 24, we had 7.6% loss. So if we are thinking about the seeding rate, we lose some plants. During the season, we lose some plants. In a 30-inch or a 24-inch, we lose more than in a narrow. And the reason is that the plants are closer together in the wider row. And the A and B in yield indicates that there is definitely an increase potential for yield if we can have narrow row spacing. So the next part I would likely quickly visit about is application of foliar nutrients. So there are many products on the market, and we see different situations where there are differences in nutritional status. So what I did is I just took random fields without a history of having lacking of nutrients, and we tried several products at R2, and we did tissue sampling before and after the application. So we have a number of products, different rates and different colors, as you can see. The nutrients in this package on the left is the treatment name, and then the pounds per acre of the nutrients that are in some of those. So basically, we're looking at some of the micronutrients, the zinc, the boron, etc. So all the packages have different combinations of nutrients. We went in after the application, July 16th, we were application of the products at R2, and then we took samples before and then 2 weeks later. So here I want to show you some of the results. So this one is the parts per million. The blue bar is the number at application. The bars in red is after application. Now, this is not due to application, because if you look here at the control where we didn't apply, you can see that as the plant keeps on growing, it also has different levels of nutrients. So we have to kind of compare it with the last control bar. But I put a box around the center ones. Those have significantly higher boron in the leaf tissue after the application. So basically, we're looking at yield. So here I have the yield in the blue. So you have to compare all the blue bars, and the control is on the right. That is for 2019. 20 is in the red bar, and the green is the 2-year. We always find a little bit variation between the numbers, but we did not see any significant in the years between the treatments, nor in the treatments if we combine them over these 2 years. Now, you can say, well, that was one trial, one location. But in this case, I'm working with many of my colleagues throughout the United States. And if you look here, these are on the map, the locations where those trials were taking place. We do have a number of locations in South Dakota, in Minnesota, and in Wisconsin. And I'm going to just show you what the results were over the US. And we're talking about 24 environments, same product, same protocol, no significant difference. And when we are looking at 2020, between 2019 and 20, so I combine 43 environments, same thing, no significant difference. So we have to realize that this one is data on random fields, not necessarily selected for lack of nutrients. We used this trial to kind of get an idea of if we can boost soybean yield. And you can see on average in the United States, the bushels were 60 bushels, so it was a fairly good yield level, but we did not see any increase in yield due to these products. So no significant differences in the trend. So the next thing that I just want to kind of reiterate that we are looking at management for two factors. One, we are looking for management to increase the yield, but we also want to have a protein level and an oil level that is high so that we can get a better price. Now, many of the growers will say, well, I'm not paid directly for oil or protein. And that is true, but the whole marketing system is based on general knowledge about quality. So on this map, it shows here data from 2010 to 2019 of the protein, and on the scale you can see the darker the color, the higher the protein. So if you look at North Dakota, and I think the northern part, and you look here, the scale has typically the lower protein compared to some of the areas more into the soybean belt. So if we are looking for us to increase our market share, we need to pay attention to protein. And the other aspect, because soybean is an oil crop, we need to look at oil. And actually, it is a little bit more dramatic here on this map, looking at the typical soybean belt in the southern part, which has higher oil, whereas North Dakota and Northwest Minnesota tends to be lower in oil. Now, it is important because buyers do buy our product and know that our protein and oil is a little lower, and there is some discount built into the basis to account for this lower oil and protein. So my colleague, Dr. Seth Nave, always puts together some of the information for the various states. And unfortunately, if you look at the combination of oil and protein, you see that North Dakota is in the box with relatively modest protein, but very low oil. And because soybean is an oil crop, we need to be aware of that. So variety selection is one thing to do, and we need to also consider that when we plant later in the season, we tend to have lower oil. And what I said earlier, with frost, our oil content is lower. So we have a few things that we can do about oil content.